If in the next 1 minute of this video, you click off, scroll to the comments, or just get distracted without giving your full attention to the story I'm about to tell you, you might have a problem with a specific area of your brain. Don't be alarmed, as the majority of people have this problem nowadays, and I will tell you what it is soon. But if you actually manage to watch this video until the end, you will have taken the first step towards recovering from this issue, so listen carefully. During the COVID lockdowns, large-scale studies examined how negative pandemic-related news affected people's general anxiety. They found that the more of this negative news a person consumed on one specific day, the more hopeless they were the following day, and the more they are worried about unrelated things. Negative news also affects how you treat other people, even though on the face of it, the two are completely unrelated. In one psychological experiment, the more negative online news people consumed, the more their levels of social trust declined, and the less likely they were to help other people. The takeaway is that negative news recalibrates a person's social expectations. They come to expect the worst of people and act accordingly. These kind of effects are sometimes called mean world syndrome. The doomscroller's worldview and perception of others becomes tainted with fear, anxiety, anger, pessimism, and depression. The world starts to look like a very nasty and scary place, including the people who inhabit it. Now you might think this is bad enough already, but here's where it gets truly scary. What we just covered warps your perception of the world, but the next part, it warps your entire brain. Scientists call it digital dementia. And if you think you're safe because you only scroll a little bit, you're not. Think again. When it comes to your ability to focus your attention, you need to keep two things in mind. First, your attention is a finite resource. You can only direct it to specific tasks and for a specific amount of time. So if you want to perform a task that demands your attention, reducing distractions is key. And the biggest distraction in the world today is the mobile phone. Scientists have found that even the mere presence of one's mobile phone takes up precious cognitive bandwidth and impairs attention. In other words, even if you resist the temptation to check your phone while completing a task, your performance will still suffer if it is there beside you. The mere presence of the phone on your desk will eat into your available cognitive bandwidth and impair your performance. This effect is especially pronounced in people who are addicted to their phone. Now, because of the 24-hour accessibility of mobile phones, doomscrollers don't generally set aside a specific time slot for doomscrolling. They do this throughout the day, reaching for their phone every few minutes while they're working, socializing, or what have you. Switching between tasks is actually more difficult than people appreciate. This constant back and forth inevitably leaves a so-called attention residue that further compromises performance. So practically, even when you put down your smartphone for a few minutes and try to focus on your work, some bits of negative information are still lingering in the background. This further eats into your limited attention bandwidth and impairs your performance. And scientists have found that the attention residue is larger when the first task is incomplete, which doomscrolling always is, as it's a never-ending activity. The second thing I want you to remember about your ability to focus your attention is that it's like a muscle of the mind. The more you train it, the stronger it becomes. The less you train it, the more it atrophies. This is why practices like concentration meditation, where you focus your attention on one specific thing, typically your breathing, have such profound positive effects. Regular meditators are able to better focus the spotlight of their attention where they want and sustain it for longer. A habit like doomscrolling does the exact opposite. Here, you're unable to focus your attention for more than a few seconds at a time. Your attention is split, and you're carrying massive attention residue. Doomscrolling is the equivalent of your mind never living out, and living it on a diet of pizza, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes. It will ruin your mind in the same way that all of these things ruin your body. The end stage of this deterioration is so-called popcorn brain. Your attention is so fractured and your brain so hooked on multitask that you can't sustain your attention on one thing for any length of time. Not only does your work or school performance decline, but offline real-world activities seem unbearingly slow and boring. Now, I'm not referring to challenging offline tasks like taking a pen and paper and solving a crossword puzzle. I'm talking about things as simple as taking a walk in the park and being in nature without checking a screen for a few minutes. An entire generation is now growing up in this state, their baseline attention span rewired for rapid, shallow switching rather than deep, sustained focus. Psychologists and psychiatrists warn that we are in the midst of a measurable cognitive decline, with ADHD diagnoses and symptoms of attention dysregulation rising sharply in adolescents and young adults. Now, losing focus is one thing, but the next effect explains something far more dangerous: why entire generations are feeling paralyzed, watching their lives pass by while knowing they could do more. This third change is the one that terrifies me the most, because it doesn't just affect your brain, it affects your entire life. Right now, there are millions of people who know exactly what they need to do to improve their lives, but they can't. And it's not because they lack willpower or motivation. When you doom scroll, Every swipe gives you a tiny hit of relief from uncertainty, just enough to quiet your discomfort for a few seconds. Psychologists call this negative reinforcement. You're not being rewarded with pleasure as much as you're escaping a mildly unpleasant state. The problem is that the underlying anxiety feeding this compulsive behavior in the first place doesn't go away. Sadly, the anxiety only gets worse, as your brain learns that the only way to cope is to not take any sort of real action, but to passively check your phone again. Over time, this pattern spills over into your everyday life. Instead of engaging your brain's task-positive networks, the ones you use for planning, decision-making, and problem-solving, you're feeding the default mode network, which is more about passive rumination. This default mode network is a system of interconnected brain regions that becomes most active when your mind is turned inward. It lights up when you're daydreaming, recalling memories, or running mental simulations of what-if scenarios. On the other hand, task-positive networks kick into gear when you direct your focus outwards and actively work towards a goal. These systems support sustained attention, working memory, planning, and deliberate problem solving. These two networks exist in a state of tension. When one switches on, the other tends to power down. Heavy doom scrollers spend far more time in the default mode network compared to the task-positive network. They are constantly scanning and passively consuming information, but they rarely shift into the mental mode needed to organize their thoughts, set priorities, and take purposeful steps forward. Over time, this imbalance weakens the neural pathways that support goal-directed thinking and strengthens those linked to passive, inward-focused rumination. In other words, your brain becomes wired for observation rather than execution. Faced with a problem, you're more likely to default to gathering more input and procrastinating instead of making a plan and executing it. If you haven't heard the term interoception before, it's basically your brain's ability to sense what's happening inside your body. So being aware of sensations like your heartbeat, breathing, hunger, thirst, if you're nauseous, if your muscles are cramped, if your chest is tight, and so on. In short, it's how your brain keeps running a status report on everything going on inside you. And the part of the brain involved in interoception is called the anterior insular cortex. Interoception is related to what we nowadays popularly call being in your body. When people talk about the ability to, quote, be in the body, this encompasses things like being aware of internal signals your body is giving you, and crucially, connecting these signals to emotions that arise. So for example, you might notice a flutter in your chest and connect it to anxiety, or feel heaviness in your limbs and realize you're fatigued. Doomscrolling interferes with this normal process in two ways. First, it hijacks your attention and locks it onto an external feed of information, pulling it away from the quiet background monitoring of your internal state. Second, it keeps your nervous system in a low-level state of hyperarousal. Nothing dramatic, but chronically aroused above the normal baseline. So your heart rate is slightly elevated, your muscles a little tense, your breath a bit shallow, and eventually those sensations blur into the background and you stop noticing them altogether. Over time, this blunting of your interoception can make it harder to recognize what you're feeling and why. For example, you might consciously register a vague sense of irritability or exhaustion, but without realizing it's because your body is reacting to a blood sugar dip from skipping lunch. Or maybe it's because you forgot to drink water all afternoon, or your shoulders are tight and aching after an hour of tense scrolling while you're hunched over your phone. When you can't connect emotions to their physiological roots, your brain has a harder time regulating your mood. Emotional states start to feel like they come out of nowhere and are harder to soothe. This is the polar opposite of how your brain changes when you engage in a practice like mindfulness meditation, where you are systematically scanning your inner body, noticing subtle internal cues and linking them to your present state. In mindfulness, you're deliberately tuning into the signals of your internal body and shutting out the noise of the outside world. In doom scrolling, you're doing the exact opposite. Again, this has real-life consequences. Research shows that when people have strong interoception attention, they're better at choosing the right strategy to regulate their emotions and deal with others. They can use strategies like reframing a situation or calming their arousal when it makes sense, and they can switch approaches depending on how intense their emotions are. But when doom scrolling dulls interoception, that flexibility disappears. People default to blunt, one-size-fits-all coping strategies like distracting themselves from uncomfortable emotion, rather than working with it or addressing its source. Think of behaviors like reaching for your phone mid-conversation when a topic gets uncomfortable, or scrolling through social media after you get a message that makes you anxious, rather than replying or clarifying what the other person said. Over time, this reflex erodes your ability to engage honestly with yourself and others, replacing nuanced emotional responses with inappropriate reflex-type actions. Luckily, there is a way to reboot your brain to its natural state. Science shows that taking a break from scrolling and other high dopamine activities like gaming allows your brain to reset back to its normal dopamine levels and reverse other structural brain changes. You don't have to stop forever, but taking a break for a couple weeks can help a lot. So if you want to learn the specific strategies to do this, watch the video on your screen next, and I'll see you there.